Hi, my name is Mary, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing with you my Informed Citizen TBR. Since in the United States we are coming up on an election year, and since I have been basically burying my head in the sand with regards to reading books about politics or current events, I thought it would be wise to look up a TBR that covers some of the major things that are being talked about in the election this year so that I can stay informed, as it were. For this process, I have come up with prompts for myself and then picked books that will fulfill those prompts, and basically the TBR has two separate parts. There is a part at the beginning which is about different kinds of politics and reading that, and then the second half of the TBR is an either-or of important issues, so I can read books about one issue or the other. You'll see how it goes as we go on. The important thing for me is that these are books about politics now. They are not history books, which is where I'm really stepping out of my comfort zone. So hopefully some of these books will be really relevant to me and will be something that sticks with me even if they're not what I typically read. Without further ado, let's start the first part of the TBR. Those are the books that are about politics more generally speaking. I will say you are welcome to take any of these prompts, do all of them, do some of them, and if you do, please let me know in the comments down below and with a link to your video or to your Goodreads or wherever so that I can follow what other people are reading for their Informed Citizen TBRs. Number one is a book about federal politics. This is politics at the national level, and for that purpose I am reading Fire and Fury Inside the Trump White House by Michael Wolff. This is a book which is all about the way that the current administration runs the White House, with an insight into what a mess it can sometimes be. This is one of the books that I've seen the most highly recommended by reviewers that I personally trust and look for, and so while the subject matter is unappetizing to say the least to me personally, this is what I am planning on reading. Number two is kind of the opposite of federal politics. That is a book about a grassroots movement. For that, I will be reading Me Too, essays about how and why this happened, what it means, and how to make sure it never happens again by Perkins. I've also been meaning to read more essays this year, and this seems like a great way to go about doing that, since Me Too is one of the big movements that is specifically related to the White House and to a lot of other eras as well, and it's something that we're taking very seriously in higher education and in academia as well, and so I'm interested in reading essays about the movement and how the movement started, and also about its ramifications in different arenas. Number three is a book by a presidential candidate. There's a lot of these going on right now, especially in the Democratic Party, because there are so many people running. The one that I particularly am interested in reading is This Fight Is Our Fight, The Battle to Save America's Middle Class by Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren I find a very interesting political candidate. It's not that I agree with all of her ideas, because there's no political candidate where I agree with all of their ideas, but just in particular I find the way that she gives speeches very interesting. I find her ideas very interesting, and I'm hoping that that translates really well into this book. Number four is a book by a member of a different political party than you. Whether you view this as it's necessary to see what common ground that we have, or whether you want to keep an eye on what the other side is doing and thinking, I think that this is extremely valuable, and it's something that in our current extremely partisan way of doing politics in America, I know I need to be more specific about making sure that I pick up. For this challenge, I am reading a book by a conservative that is conscious of a conservative, A Rejection of Destructive Politics and a Return to Principle by Jeff Flake, which is kind of about the conservative ethos, basically, generally speaking, which I want to get a closer look into, especially in the 21st century, because it's something that I've always tackled in a historical lens rather than in a contemporary lens in my reading, so we'll see how this one goes. For the second half of this TBR, what I really wanted to do was to make sure that I had as many of the political, the debate points and the political issues that are the major talking points that I've seen in debates and in discussions right now. Because there are so many of them, I've doubled them up. So it's either one or the other. I plan on trying to read books for as many of these as I possibly can, but obviously you never know what's going to happen in a month, and so I think it's unrealistic for me to say that I will read both. So personally, I am picking one that I plan on reading and then one for if I have time. The first pair that I have chosen is a book about immigration or a book about international relations. For this challenge, I personally will be reading a book about immigration, and I will be reading The Good Immigrant, 26 Writers Reflect on America, which is edited by Nikesh Shulka and Shimen Suleiman. Again, I'm wanting to read more essays this year, and in particular, I think for the immigrant experience, I want to read as many different authors as possible, and so that it makes sense for me to read an essay collection. For international relations, this is the one that I'll be reading if I have time. I'll be reading Russian Roulette, The Inside Story of Putin's War on America and the Election of Donald Trump by Michel Isikoff and David Korn. This one is a somewhat contentious book because obviously the subject is extremely contentious, and I'm fully aware of that. However, I would like to read the argument for this side and, just generally speaking, read a little bit more about contemporary Russia-US relations. I think that that would be very interesting. The next pairing of issues that I have chosen is a book about reproductive rights or a book about gun control. And for these purposes, I am choosing to prioritize a book about reproductive rights. For this challenge, I will be reading How All Rights Became Reproductive Rights, From Welfare Reform to Foreclosure to Trump by Laura Briggs. I think that this is very interesting because what I am fascinated by in the field of reproductive rights is how it is a ongoing constant battle. There are some political issues that seem to be one and unresolved. The one that I think of to mind is gay marriage. There is not a currently right now, big conservative push to repeal the Gay Marriage Act. It just seems to have happened, whereas it seems like no matter what strides are made in reproductive rights, there is a constant pushback, and so it's rights that are extremely contentious right now, and I would like to see how that impacts the way that other issues in the country are handled. If I have time for a book about gun control, I'll be picking up Parkland by Dave Cullen. This is a book about the Parkland school shooting, but more specifically, it is a book about how the students at that particular school went about campaigning for gun control reform after it. And I read another Dave Cullen book either last year or the year before. I read his book on Columbine and really enjoyed it. And I mean, enjoyed as in I thought it was a good book and I thought it was interesting and compelling, not that I enjoy Columbine. So I think this book will be a great book to turn to as I try to grapple with the gun control debate. The third pairing that I have chosen is a book about the environment or a book about the economy. For this purposes, I will be choosing a book about the environment, and I've chosen We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast by Jonathan Safran Foer. This is a book about what everyday people can do to help the environmental disaster, and I'm interested to see what this book offers as solutions, because in my particular view, very little that the average everyday consumer can do in their day-to-day lives makes as much difference as what the industrial system in our country puts out into the environment on a daily basis. So I'm hoping that this book is not preachy, but it is insightful and helpful, and we'll see how that happens. If I have time, the book about the economy that I'll be reading is called Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. This is a book about families in Milwaukee who are struggling to just keep a roof over their heads, like the bare minimum to survive in this city, and about what economic factors and what systems are in place that both help and hinder them. And I think that this one has been praised pretty highly by everybody that I personally know who has read it, and so cross fingers that this one will be a good and compelling and interesting read. The next pairing that I have is a book about the justice system or a book about race. For this, I will be prioritizing a book about the justice system, although there is quite a bit of race in here as well, and I'll be reading Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. I believe Olive at A Book Olive hosted a read-along for this book in the recent past, and just from everything that I've been hearing about it, about how heartbreaking it is, because it is written by a lawyer who is trying to get people off of death row, and what that means in our justice system today, especially when it's abundantly obvious, at least from an outside observer's perspective, that someone is both innocent or just that they don't deserve to die for what they did. And so I am fully recognizing that I will cry probably while I'm reading this book, and we'll see how that goes. The book about race that I have chosen, if I have the time, is When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir by Patrice Concoulers and Aisha Bendel. This is a memoir about the Black Lives Matter movement, and it is a movement that I think is so impactful and powerful today that it's a shame that I don't know terribly much about it, and so from this insider memoir perspective, I'm hoping to gain both a personal and a kind of manifesto from the movement about what they believe and how they're planning on achieving their goals, and I'm sure I'm going to cry at this one as well. The next pairing that I have is a book about voting or a book about nationalism. For that, I will be prioritizing the book about nationalism, and I will be reading Proud Boys and the White Ethno-State, How the Alt-Right is Warping the American Imagination by Alexandra Minna Stern. It may have not slipped you by that a lot of people are talking about the new masculinity and what's wrong with some of the new masculinity and how we are failing young men in our country and how this is driving so many young men to look for nationalist causes to join. And so this one in particular I think is so important and sounds so valuable going forward that it definitely has to be on my TBR. A book about voting that I will read if I do have the time is The Politics of Voter Suppression, Defending and Expanding America's Right to Vote by Tova Andrea Wang. This is a book about how there are systems in place which discourage not just everybody from voting, but specific populations from voting and how we can combat that. Because obviously one of the most important things to do to exercise your political rights is to vote, to make sure that the people that are in power are the people that are supporting your interests. And so I would like to read a little bit more about not just specifically what is voter suppression, but how it can be combated, hopefully at every level. The final pairing that I have is a book about technology or a book about healthcare. For these purposes, I have chosen a book about technology, and that is Antisocial, Online Extremists, Techno-Utopians, and the Hijacking of the American Conversation by Andrew Marantz. This is a book about how online trolls are not just impacting people personally and kind of in an interconnected way among friends, but also are impacting national conversations and the way that politics are shaking out in our country, which I think is extremely important. If I have the time, the book about healthcare that I'm most interested in right now is called An American Sickness, How American Healthcare Became Big Business and How You Can Take It Back by Elizabeth Rosenthal. This is a book about the privatization of American healthcare, why, for example, in America we do not have a national healthcare system, whereas there is a national healthcare system or equivalent in so many developed places in the world, and what we can do about that. And I think that it is such an important issue to talk about, especially as we teeter on the brink of another war in the Middle East. We seem to always have money for war and not enough to take care of our own citizens back home, and so I'm interested to see what this author says we can do on a personal level to take back our healthcare system. Now, because the election happens in November, which is the 11th month of the year, I figured I would offer an 11th option if you have the time. That is a Wildcard about any issue that is important to you that has not been discussed. And I have two picks for this one. The first one that I'm interested in is called How to Fight Anti-Semitism by Barry Weiss, which is about how prevalent anti-Semitism, that is anti-Jewish sentiment, is in day-to-day conversations and how to make sure that that does not proliferate in our communities and in our conversations to this day, especially when there is so much kind of cryptic anti-Semitism that people don't know is anti-Semitic. And especially as we have a prominent presidential candidate that is Jewish right now, and because there have been a string of, especially around Hanukkah, there was a string of violent anti-Semitic attacks or anti-Semitic graffiti and things like that prominently in the news. I think that this is extremely important that I read. Number 2 that I have on this list is called Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland by Jonathan M. Metzelbayan. This is a book about not just what racism does to Black people and to people of color, but what it's also doing to American cities and American towns, especially in the kind of center of the country, and how it's actually a quite bad thing for white people as well. Obviously, it's such a contentious thing to say that, oh, this is affecting white people as well, so that's why we should care. However, I do think that it's important to see how everybody is impacted by this issue and how the consequences of racism are doing more to stir the pot and to bring up racial resentment, especially for white people who think that some things are the fault of people of color when they are the fault of themselves and other ingrained systems. So I will leave the prompts in my description down below. Please let me know what you are reading as we come up into an election year. Even if you're not doing these prompts, even if you have your own reading scheduled, I'd love to connect with other people that are trying to read more consciously about the world around them. Thank you very much for watching. Bye!